His belief in the incidence of spontaneous human combustion prompted Charles Dickens to include mention of this bizarre phenomenon in a few of his literary works. A Christmas Carol and Bleak House both have elements of Gothic literature penned within their pages, but just how much might be fact, and how much might be fiction, when it comes to the ability of a human body to spontaneously burst into flame? Charles Dickens thought strongly enough about the validity of this scientific fact to make a point of it in his preface for Bleak House, where he quite adamantly defended his stance on the matter in response to comments made by George Henry Lewis, his close friend. The subject of their public debate is one that is still questioned today, and for good reason. Spontaneous human combustion shouldn't be discounted as urban legend. In fact, with our modern-day technologies and research methods, we may finally be able to prove the validity of this occurrence, no matter how unbelievable it may seem. Charles Dickens writes about spontaneous human combustion in A Christmas Carol, Stave II, the second of the three spirits, in 1843. The reader finds Ebenezer Scrooge trembling in his bed as he awaits the arrival of a second spirit, who he was told would soon come to pay him a visit. He is so nervous that he was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at that very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. 52. Now that's a frightened man for you. It is certainly a comment that grabs the attention of the reader, as it adds a bit of shock value to this classic Gothic tale. Dickens again mentions this strange mode of deathly demise in his 1853 novel Bleak House. In the appointed time. Chapter 32, Mr. Guppy and Tony are conspiring over some important papers that Krook has in his possession. As they impatiently await the 12 o'clock hour, they notice that a hateful soot is hanging about 515. The room that Tony is renting is located above Krook's rag and bottle wool shop, and it is here where they have met together. At one point Mr. Guppy is seated upon a windowsill in the room, and when touching it, he is appalled to find that a thick, yellow liquor defiles them, which is offensive to the touch and sight, and more offensive to the smell of 516. Charles Dickens references the soot's omnipresence in the room multiple times throughout this chapter, and he expands upon the presence of the yellow substance that, from the corner of the windowsill, it slowly drips and creeps away down the bricks. Here lies in a little thick nauseous pool of 516. He ingeniously sets up the scene for the reader to be completely repulsed so that by the end of the chapter, when Mr. Guppy and Tony find what remains of Krook, as of a charred and broken log of wood sprinkled with white ashes, they have been given a detailed account of what Victorian science has found to be a common denominator in cases of spontaneous human combustion of 519. Just to clarify, and to make sure there is no doubt of Krook's cause of death to a single reader, Dickens spells this out as plainly and clearly as possible. He has the narrator shout from the pages by way of the use of exclamation points in the dialogue sentence prior, in explanation. Call the death by any name your highness will, attribute it to whom you will, or say it might haven been prevented how you will, it is the same death eternally, inborn, inbred, engendered in the corrupted humours of the vicious body itself, and that only spontaneous combustion, and none other of all the deaths that can be died of 519. And he stirs up a debate with the scientist, philosopher, and literary critic George Henry Lewis, who protested the impossibility of such a manner of death in an article published in the Leader, Taylor 171. Lewis' actual comment to Dickens, directly concerning the subject, can be found in the letters of George Henry Lewis in his A Letter to Charles Dickens, where he appeals that your genius has moved with beneficent power in so many other directions than that of physiology, it would cost you nothing to avow a mistake, even were you not countenanced by a host of very respectable authorities, as is the case in this mistaken hypothesis of spontaneous combustion, but Dickens would not be slighted. Charles Dickens included a public response to Mr. Lewis in the pages of the preface to Bleak House, as he refers to my good friend Mr. Lewis, published some ingenious letters to me at the time when that event was chronicled, arguing that spontaneous combustion could not possibly be. But there are about 30 cases on record, and he continues by citing two specific cases, as well as mentioning that they are the recorded opinions and experiences of distinguished medical professionals, in modern days as 6 to 7. Charles Dickens clearly was an extremely bright man who had a very imaginative mind. These characteristics couldn't have been made any more obvious to the average layperson as soon as he or she were to read any one of his essays, short stories, or novels. He took great pains to make sure his fiction writing contained real-life accuracies, and he spent much time researching the subjects he chose to write about. Writing about the phenomenon of spontaneous human combustion was no exception, and he researched the subject at length, even to go so far as to comment on this in the preface of Bleak House. When he writes, "I have no need to observe that I do not willfully or negligently mislead my readers, and that before I wrote that description I took pains to investigate the subject as 6. Dickens stood by his views as he was contenting himself with observing, that he shall not abandon the facts until there shall have been a considerable spontaneous combustion of the testimony on which human occurrences are usually received, while at the same time adding a bit of his satirical humour play on words to his comments. 7. In 1833 Dr. Edmund Sharkey wrote a piece for the Dublin Journal of Medical and Chemical Science in which he gave his personal and professional observations on this very controversial subject of the times. He felt that the spontaneous combustion of the human body is a subject which has, until modern times, been regarded with incredulity by the world in general, but has ever been viewed by the medical philosopher as one of the most extraordinary in his or any other department of physical science. Sharkey 321. He commented that the name English medical writers gave it at the time was actually catacausis ebriosa. Sharkey 321. It's very interesting that Dr. Sharkey describes many of the same attributes of the phenomenon, or a disease, as he actually calls it, that Dickens mirrored on paper. Upon evaluating the scene of a spontaneous combustion death, it was noticed that the bed was spread over with a moist and ash-colored soot. On a part of the windows trickled down a greasy, loathsome, yellowish liquor, and thereabout they smelt a stink, and saw the soot fly around, and this detailed description, as given by Dr. Starkey, echoed similar descriptions given in other accounts of spontaneous human combustion of that time, as well as those given in more current times. 323. In 19th-century Victorian England, the conclusion of spontaneous human combustion could be cited as cause of death in both newspapers and coroner's reports. A number of medical doctors and scientists of the times fully supported these findings, yet others continued to renounce such theories. Dr. Sharkey cites 3 different cases of spontaneous combustion, and offers numerous explanations as to how such an occurrence might possibly happen, concluding that the foregoing views, I think, are sufficient for enabling us to conceive how the human body may become inflammable. 331. Sharkey also quotes Dr. Mason Good on the subject as saying, "It seems one of the curious links in the long chain of morbid affections, and equally demands our attention as pathologists and physiologists." 321. No matter how much they were pooh-poohed, these doctors, and other doctors like them, looked at this mysterious disease as a serious, although extremely rare, condition that they were hoping to understand much better. Over the past few centuries, numerous cases of spontaneous human combustion have been accounted, and the cause of which still remains a mystery, but they all seem to share some common traits. First off, there is frequently no obvious external heat source to be found. Secondly, despite the fact that the body itself has been consumed by the fire, things within the immediate vicinity are nearly left untouched. Finally, in cases where the bodies are not fully destroyed, it is common to find body parts that are whole, often still clothed right next to parts that have turned to ash. Gromb 29. Just as in Crook's room, and the immediate surroundings near his passing, in most recorded cases of spontaneous human combustion, there is the relative lack of fire damage which might surround the victims. Strange as it may seem, more often than not it is the human body that has basically turned to ash, with an extremity or two fully clothed and intact, quite often though, and although there may be some charring, it hasn't been all that common for the location where the body is found to have suffered much fire damage. In Dr. Sharkey's account of spontaneous combustion concerning the Countess Cornelia Bandy, he recounts a heap of ashes, 2 legs untouched from the foot to the knee, with their stockings on. The air in the room was also observed cumbered with soot floating in it. The bed received no damage. 323. Similarly, in 1965, D.J.G. writes in Medicine, Science, and the Law about a victim who was grossly incinerated. Apart from the right foot which lay beyond the damaged floorboards, the hearthrug was undamaged, but was greasy with many fragments of fat on its surface. 37. More recently, the Central Teaching University Hospital, Pellegrin in Bordeaux, France released like findings in the Journal of Clinical Forensic Medicine. Describing the appearance of the bodies in 5 such cases, 5 forensic pathologists examined that none of the bodies were completely destroyed. Certain parts were perfectly preserved and identifiable, whereas others, including teeth in some cases, were totally reduced to a state of ashes. 4 of the cases, the cadavers were wearing clothes that were intact distally. Gromb 29. So what explanation could possibly account for this bizarre coincidence between these victims? Theories of an outside heat source in combination with high alcohol levels in the blood stream were considered for attributing to this type of death. People with an elevated degree of fat tissue in their bodies and causing a candle effect when exposed to an external heat source was also considered, but these examples would explain simple human combustion and nothing that could be considered to be spontaneous, at least not from an internal heat source alone. Of course, it has been scientifically proven for objects to have the capacity to burst into flames without an external heat source. Consider a pile of turpentine-soaked rags that have been placed in an open container. The internal temperature can rise high enough to ignite the flammable substance as oxygen from the air penetrates the rags. What about piles of hay that have been known to spontaneously combust? The decomposition process happening from the bacteria inside can produce enough heat to kindle a flame. Watson. Can a human body also produce a high enough heat, while at the same time provide its own flammable substance, in order to spontaneously combust? Some theorists believe so. What if the human body produced a methane buildup in the intestinal tract, and it was ignited by protein enzymes? Better yet, isn't hydrogen flammable? Then what if a chemical reaction somehow took place in the human body that separated water into its components of hydrogen and oxygen, and when reintroduced after chemical change, boom? What about the case of Gloria Ramirez, who showed up in an emergency room in Riverside, California in February of 1994? This bizarre story made headlines around the globe, and many wondered about her toxic death, especially when they heard about the blood gases that escaped her during emergency treatment, and which make the hospital staff who were near her become violently ill. If the human body can undergo a chemical change such as hers did, after being exposed to certain external chemicals, those little changes can sometimes lead to big results. And in severe cases, the vapors kill a stone. With consideration to strange chemical changes that can take place in the human body, what about ketosis? Conditions like alcoholism, fat-free dieting, and diabetes can cause ketosis, at which time acetone is formed. Acetone is a highly flammable substance. Ford. Enough said. As much as there has been plenty of scientific research to try to debunk this strange theory, the fact remains that there continues to be way too many unanswered medical questions about this mysterious means of death, certainly enough to warrant further study, and not close the case on the theory of spontaneous human combustion. Charles Dickens may surely have helped to prove that fact is stranger than fiction.